Okay, so let's pray. Lord, I just thank you tonight. Thank you that we do have a safe place and a comfortable place to come and study your word. I ask that you're with me as a teacher, that I can teach your word effectively and bring across the lessons you want me to bring. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so Esther, like many books of the Old Testament, we don't know who wrote Esther. It's possible it was Mordecai, who's one of the main characters in this story, but that's really just a guess. It was almost certainly written not long after the events it describes takes place, which was during the reign of the Persian king Xerxes, who was around from 486 BC to 464 BC. And by the way, depending on the translation you're using when you read the Bible, it might call him Xerxes or it might call him Ahasuerus, which just two names for the same guy. I'm going to be using the name Xerxes throughout just because it's a whole lot easier to pronounce. But either name is appropriate for him. Esther is the last of the historical books in the Bible. And so the question is, can we trust it as a true story, or is it just a fable or a morality play to teach us some lessons? And to answer this, I'm going to quote a commentator. The story of Esther is quite extraordinary, with its pantomime characters and fantastic timing. Esther is a beautiful princess in danger of her life. The Jewish people are threatened with extinction by the wicked vizier, Haman. King Xerxes is as unpredictable as he is powerful and can command anyone's death at any moment. But although the story sounds as if it leapt off the tales of Arabian Nights or the histories of Herodotus, it is carefully written. The author quotes the place in which the story is set, a provincial capital, Susa, and the date, the third year of the king's reign. If this is a novel, it's based on many accurate facts. The person writing has inside knowledge of the Persian court and government, as well as strong sympathies with the Jewish people caught up in its power play. So, though the story is laid out in a way to teach us specific lessons, there's really no reason to doubt its historical veracity. There's no reason to consider it anything other than a true story, because it is a true story. And always remember that reading any of the historical books in the Bible, just remember that God can multitask. He can arrange the events of history to play out in specific ways. So the historical books of the Bible are both accurate accounts of real events and carefully constructed morality plays. There's no reason we have to choose between the two, because God can easily arrange it so that both are true at the same time. And that is what he did. In fact, God does a beautiful job of setting up the events to be a series of ironic reversals that highlight the themes and the lessons we need to learn from this. There's also some aspects of the books that have actually bothered both Jewish and Christian scholars through the centuries. This is the one book in the Bible that never actually mentions God. His name's not in there once. And it also promotes a Jewish festival that's not found in the books of Moses. But despite this, it's considered by both Christians and Orthodox Jews to be a part of the Holy Scripture. And that's because, although God is not mentioned, we see his divine providence throughout the book. We see God at work arranging events to put exactly the right people in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to save the Jewish people from destruction. One commentator wrote, "The way the story is told makes it clear that, even when God is most hidden, he is still present and working to protect and deliver his." So divine providence is there. God is there even if we're not shouting his name out. There's also a theme of human responsibility. God doesn't need us to do his work, but he has chosen to use us. He has given us the honor and the joy of carrying out the task he gives us to bring him glory and honor. So Mordecai will choose to take definite action when he learns about a plot against the king. Well, Esther's willingness to risk her life later in the book is a personally heroic act that shows a trust in God. Both Mordecai and Esther have free will, and they exercise that will by choosing to do what is right in the eyes of God, and then trusting in the Holy Spirit for guidance to follow through. God is at work through the actions of the faithful, just as he is today. To quote from Ephesians, we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So we all have things we can do for God, and we have free will about whether to be obedient to God and do those jobs or not. Now, the time and the setting of the book is important to keep in mind. It takes place in the 5th century BC. This is some decades after the Jews were given permission to return to their homeland from Babylonian exile. So remember, they'd been conquered by the Babylonians. The Babylonians, in turn, were conquered by the Persians, and a Persian king allowed the Jews to return home and rebuild Jerusalem. Some Jews had remained behind, and Esther is a part of their story. One of the themes of the book, then, is how do followers of God get by while living in a pagan world? The answer seems to be that they must seek the good of their ruler and their neighbors and put their trust in God in times of persecution. Although the Jews kill many of their enemies at the end of the story of Esther, spoiler alert, and see the sons of Haman hanged, there's a strong message in their refusal to take any plunder from their victims. They will defend themselves against injustice, but their welfare and hope is in God alone. So even if we are surrounded by a pagan culture, it is possible to live a life that is holy and pleasing to God. So once again, though we see that God is not mentioned in the book, his presence is felt throughout the story. And in the end, we're reminded to put our hope and our trust in God alone. We are reminded to put our trust and hope in God alone in our own lives as well. And to quote Romans 15, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope." So we see God's presence in an ironic way also in the moral ambiguity of the main characters. Esther and Mordecai, I believe, are godly people, but they're not perfect. There's some implications in there. Some commentators point out hints that they may have made some moral compromises in their lives, that they may have become more a part of Babylonian culture than they were supposed to. I'm not sure I completely agree with the commentators about this, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. But remember that the Bible does not hold up the heroes of the Bible to be paragons of virtue. Jesus obviously being the exception of that. He actually was a paragon of virtue. But so Esther and Mordecai would have been like the rest of us, sinners who need God's forgiveness. But God still uses them. And despite the exile and the moral compromising that some Jews in exile were undoubtedly guilty of, we see in this book that God has not abandoned his people. To quote a Bible Project video about Esther, Esther invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history. And he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. So that's the introduction. Let's dive into the book itself. Now, because of time constraints, as fascinating as I am, you probably don't want to be here till 1 in the morning. I'm not gonna hit every verse. I'll be skipping over some parts, but we'll be hitting all the important highlights. And we'll start right at the beginning with the fall of Queen Vashti. You can see the book as God setting up all these dominoes in exactly the right spot to be tumbled at exactly the right moment to fulfill his purpose. And the first domino is the fall of Queen Vashti. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. So the first few verses of the book sets up the situation in a very concise manner. Xerxes was ruler of the vast Persian Empire, which, by best estimates, 44% of the people who were living at that time in the world lived in the Persian Empire. So if you were alive, there was almost 50-50 chance that you lived within the realm of King Xerxes. It was a big place. And in 483 BC, the 3rd year of his reign, he was throwing a huge party for all the important people in his empire, a party that we learn in later verses would last for 180 days. And this literally a 6-month-long celebration. As David Guzik points out, the basic reason for these feasts was, of course, pride. The king wanted to impress his subjects with a great display of his own wealth and power and majesty and generosity. I like David Guzik's commentary on this book, so I actually stole quite a bit from him in this time, as you'll notice. But as the story goes on, we see that Xerxes, in his pride, wanted to show off his hot trophy wife to everybody. So he sends for Xerxes, or he sends for Vashti. On the seventh day, when Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. So this, as we'll see, is the first of a series of events that will end up putting a young Jewish woman in a position where she'll be able to save the entire Jewish race from destruction. Xerxes calls for his wife Vashti because he wants to show her off to everybody at the party. But she refuses. And the author of the book does not explain why she refused, but there's a reasonable supposition to be made as to why. In verse 9, we're told that Vashti was hosting a separate party for the women in the palace. In Persian culture, the women were often kept separate from the men and were expected to wear veils to hide themselves. In his drunken state, Xerxes could have been asking her, by the lights of that culture, to expose herself in a degrading or vulgar manner. And she simply refused to do so. That's all supposition, but it's reasonable. It's the likeliest explanation that he was asking his wife to do something undignified and crude and embarrassing. Vashti actually found a huge fan in a 19th century theologian named Adam Clarke, who wrote, What woman possessing even a common share of prudence and modesty could consent to expose herself to the view of such a group of drunken bacchanalians? Her courage was equal to her modesty. She would resist the holy mandate rather than violate the rules of chaste decorum. Hail, noble woman, be thou a pattern of all thy sex on every similar occasion. On the other hand, there is like another theory.
Your Highness, the king was wondering if you could make him a sandwich. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, but he says that he's the king, and whatever he says goes. Well, I'm the queen, and the king can make his own sandwich. Okay. You can't do this to me. I'm the queen. Oh, you wanna bet? The king can do whatever he wants. He's the king. And don't come back.
Don't you think that might have been a little harsh?
Oh, no way. If she got away with that, no one would listen to you.
Well, what am I going to do now?
It looks like we're gonna have to find you a new queen.
Make me a sandwich.
Okay, so either she didn't want to degrade herself to a bunch of drunks, or she simply refused to make a sandwich. One or the other. But whatever her reason for refusing, she was disobeying the all-powerful king, and she was doing so publicly. That was a big no-no, and it had consequences. After consulting with his nobles, Xerxes gets this advice. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. And also let the king give her royal position to someone who is better than she. So Vashti is out, and Xerxes needs a new trophy wife. So the story begins with the consequences of a prideful king making a bad decision while drunk. Xerxes has acted in a sinful manner, and he's completely responsible to God for his sins. But God can turn all things to good, and Xerxes' sinful actions represent the first step in God's plan to eventually save his people. God is watching out for his people, even though still in exile. He's always faithful to his promises. He will punish Israel when necessary, even punish them very harshly. But he will never abandon or forsake them. God still loves his people, and he still has plans to use them to bring both Jews and Gentiles the Messiah. So his hand is behind all of this, using the sinful acts of sinful people to eventually turn everything to good. So that was the first domino, the fall of Queen Vashti. The next one is the rise of Esther. Xerxes does need a new trophy wife. He's not looking for like romantic love or a companion he can have a good conversation with. He just wants somebody who can throw parties for the women at their side of the palace and looks nice in court. So how does he find one? Once again, his advisors have a plan. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given them. Then let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. Later in verse 16, we learn that all this happened in 479 BC, the 7th year of his reign. So 4 years had gone by since the big party and Vashti's downfall to the time where he decided he needed a new queen. During that time, Xerxes had invaded Greece, but he had suffered a huge defeat at the naval battle of Salamis in 480 BC. So in David Guzik's commentary on Esther, he proposes quite reasonably, I think, that Xerxes was looking for sensual pleasure to comfort himself after this huge setback. So this is where we meet Esther. And we're up to chapter 2, verse 5. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shammai, son of Kish, who had been carried off into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Jerusalem, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So Mordecai is a Jew living in Susa. He is amongst the Jews who did not return to Jerusalem after the exile ended. And Mordecai is a Babylonian name. It was Mordecai's great-grandfather who had been taken from Jerusalem during the exile about 120 years earlier. So Susa would have been Mordecai's home all his life. It seems that his family had successfully acclimated themselves to Persian culture and had chosen not to return to Jerusalem. It's even possible that Mordecai was hiding the fact that he and his family were Jewish. We don't know that for sure. That's just a possible assumption. Certainly Esther was going to keep this a secret when she was taken into the palace and made queen. So it's not unreasonable that he had already keeping his family history a secret. So Mordecai had been raising Esther, and I think it's safe to say that he loved her like a daughter. I think that's clear when we read the story. Esther, by the way, is her Persian name, and it means star. Her Jewish name, Hadassah, means myrtle, which was a flower common to the Mediterranean rain. So the king's looking for a new trophy wife, and among the candidates chosen to be brought to the palace to apply for the job is the beautiful young Esther. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. So we're told she was taken, and we're not given enough context to know exactly how all that played out. This being the king's orders, is probably she was simply ordered to do this by the authorities. You may or may not be the king's new wife, report to the palace immediately, and she had to go. And that is almost certainly how it played out. What Esther thought of this, we can't know. Arranged marriages were common, so that by itself wouldn't have been too shocking. And she got a year's worth of preferential treatment in the palace before she was brought to the king. So in many ways, it wasn't an unpleasant experience. But still, if she was given no choice, it's a reminder that many cultures did not, and still today do not, honor and respect women the way God expects us to. Esther was simply caught up in events beyond her control, and she would have had no idea at this point that God had a rather important task in her for the near future. She was taken away from her family and brought to the palace. And it may have not been a horrible captivity, but that's basically what it was. And in verses 10 and 11, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day, he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So Mordecai refuses to reveal that she is Jewish. And this is where some commentators question whether Mordecai was in the right here or not. From this and other statements in the book, it is clear the author is making a point that God protected and used Esther and Mordecai in spite of the fact that they were not living according to the law commanded by God to the people of Israel. By law, Esther was not to marry a pagan or have sexual relations with a man who was not her husband, and yet this was the purpose of her being included in the harem. Esther could be contrasted to Daniel, who refused to eat the things from the king's table because the food would have included items unclean by Jewish law. Apparently, Esther had no qualms about the food he ate. She certainly did not set herself apart as Daniel had done. I wanted to share that because that's the honest opinion of some knowledgeable commentators, but I don't know if I completely agree with this. If Esther was given a choice, do you want to try and be queen? And she said, sure, I'll give it a try. Then she's open to these criticisms. If, as is much more likely, she was probably just told she had to go, and be a part of the harem and maybe marry the king and had no personal choice in the matter, then that makes her a victim, not a sinner in this case. She's like anybody, she would have been a sinner who needed forgiveness for her sins. But this wouldn't have been one of her if she wasn't given a choice. So I wanted to share that opinion because it is a sincere opinion from some commentators, but I simply disagree with it. I don't think we can hold Esther at fault for things that she had no control over. Some commentators are a lot less critical of Mordecai. Whoops, pushed the wrong button. Here's David Guzik again. However, we do recognize that there are situations where God may have us be reticent about our Christian identity. He's referring to Mordecai telling Esther to hide her Jewishness, not for the purposes of permanently concealing it, but waiting for the opportune moment to reveal it. Apparently, this is what Mordecai sensed was the right thing to do in this circumstance, and Esther agreed. For example, in some situations, one might initially act as if they know nothing when approached by a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon, and do it not to deny Jesus, but to seize a strategic opportunity. So when Mordecai told her to hide the fact that she was Jewish, his intentions might have been the best, and not any way denying God. So we don't know for sure what their hearts were at the beginning of the book. It may be fair to think that Mordecai and Esther did not set themselves apart the way Daniel had. They may have been at fault in some ways there. They may have adapted themselves into Persian culture and perhaps made some moral compromises along the way. That's very possible. God, though, is still planning on using them to do great things. This story works either way, and they turn out to be heroes of the faith either way, because when the chips are down, they do the right thing. And we see that all through the Bible. We see flawed people who commit horrible sins turning back to God and doing the right thing because they trusted in God in the end. So, and then Mordecai's good points need to be emphasized as well. You know, as I said earlier, I think it's clear that he loved Esther as a daughter. And we see here that he's taken to hanging out near the palace to be able to check up on her, help her when he could, and give her advice. So far, all this stuff seems to be happening at random. You know, Vashti is removed from being queen as a consequence of the king's drunken desire to show her off to his guests. Esther is chosen as a possible replacement and brought to the palace, where she catches the eye of the head eunuch and gets preferential treatment that will eventually help her get selected to be queen. So God is not overtly mentioned, but we can see him arranging the dominoes in exactly the right order to rescue his people from Haman when the time comes. You know, God is faithful, and he has not forgotten his promises to his people. Deuteronomy 7:9. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. So anyway, the point we're here in the story is Esther and probably several hundred other women go through 12 months of beauty treatments involving oils and perfumes. Part of the reason, so Alice would have said, yes, I'll go. So, okay. Part of the reason that they make this so lengthy is to check to see if any of the women who were all supposed to be virgins, but just in case any of them were pregnant before they were brought before the king, so the baby can't be said to belong to the king, which could have like political consequences. A 17th century theologian named Matthew Poole suggested another reason for all this preparation. The bodies of men and women in those hot countries did of themselves yield very ill sense, if not corrected and qualified by art. So the king simply didn't want any unpleasantly smelly women brought to him. So when it was a woman's turn, she was brought to the king for an evening. And to quote David Guzik again, I really did steal a lot from him. It sounds wonderful, a year of constant spa treatments, yet the destiny of these women should be considered. One evening with the king. If he chooses them from the 400 others to be his queen, then she would be his companion until she displeased him. As for the 399 who lost, they were banished to the harem, where they stayed the wife or the concubine of the king, but rarely, if ever, saw him afterwards. If they were never free to marry, and they were never free to marry another man, essentially living as a perpetual widow. So once again, we see that in Persian culture, women were not treated with the respect and honor that God wants them to. Angela's already shot down my idea of multiple wives. I thought they could divide the housework up, but she says no. So, okay. I couldn't remember she said that. Okay. Eventually, but Carrie said you could do it. Okay. Eventually, it was Esther's turn. Now, the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. So Esther is now the queen. So the chief wife or queen consort was privileged to wear a royal tiara or crown. She was the acknowledged head of the female apartments of the gymnasium, that's just the palace. And the concubines recognized her position by bowing before her. On great occasions, the king would entertain the men in one part of the palace, and she would entertain the women in the other part of the palace. She had a large revenue assigned to her, not so much by the decree of her husband as by established law or custom. Her clothing was the best the palace could afford, and she was able to indulge freely in any love she might have for ornaments and jewelry. So in a material sense, Esther's in pretty good shape. But it's really a lonely life. The king will call you to him when he wants to, which we see at one point was more than a month before from the last time she had seen him. There's no love there. He just wants to be able to show her off, and she has to run parties on her half, and that's her whole life. It's all the material stuff she gets. There's nothing about it that would be emotionally or spiritually satisfying. But God, nonetheless, has arranged for Esther to be exactly where she needs to be when the time comes for her to act. God's setting up, at this point, the next domino to fall. And this is Mordecai saves the king. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the gates, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. When the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All of this was recorded in the book of the annuals in the presence of the king. So because Mordecai was faithful in looking after Esther, he just happened to be in position to overhear two men planning an assassination. And we don't know why these guys wanted to kill the king. It's very possible it was in revenge for the divorce of Vashti. Maybe they had relatives who had died in the Battle of Salamis, where Xerxes got whomped by the Greeks. Whatever the reason, when Mordecai turns them in, they're arrested and they're executed in a rather unpleasant manner. Mordecai's part in this was duly recorded, but somehow or other he was forgotten about afterwards. Xerxes does not come out looking good throughout this whole thing. He either just blindly does what his advisors tell him to, or he loses track almost immediately of a guy who saved his life. He might have been drunk. Yeah. But even being forgotten about, we could later see was a part of God's plan. Mordecai's key role in uncovering the assassination plot would be publicly celebrated at just the right moment a few years later. So that brings us to chapter 3, and this is the very heart of Esther's story. We're actually jumping ahead a few more years out. These events probably begin in 474 BC. So this is about 4 years after Esther has become queen. And with this, we meet the villain of the piece. Haman plots to destroy the Jews. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than those of other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. So we meet Haman, who's a descendant of King Agag, the Amalekite, who was an enemy of Israel, who had been defeated by King Saul a few centuries earlier. He'd been promoted to a very high position in the court of King Xerxes. In Persian culture, this meant you bow down to him as a sign of respect and homage. Now, Mordecai refuses to bow, and we don't exactly know why. Often it's taught that he was just refusing to worship somebody, but the bowing down wasn't necessarily worship, but just respect to a leader. We soon see that Haman has an ego roughly the size of Asia itself. So perhaps he was obligating people not just to show respect, but also to worship him. That's actually perfectly in keeping with his character. That's something Mordecai as a Jew wouldn't do. It's possible that Mordecai knew enough about Haman to know he just wasn't worthy of respect. Or, I forget what I said for or, and I can't turn the page. There we go. Or he didn't want to bow down to a descendant of the enemy of Jews. Whatever the reason, Mordecai refused to bow, and somebody rats out the fact to Haman that he's a Jew. So as I mentioned, Haman has a really, really, really big ego, even bigger than mine, which is enormous. Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him enrages him to literally insane levels. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. Mordecai is a Jew, therefore Haman must destroy all the Jews. Anti-Semitism is not a new thing. We see that in this story. And Haman was probably already a virulent anti-Semite. So now Mordecai's actions had brought this hatred to the forefront of his ego at a time when he had the power to do something about it. So the next thing he does is cast lots to determine a good day for destroying the Jews, ending up with a date about a year away. Haman was probably anxious to get started with this plan for mass murder, but he was superstitious enough to trust in casting the lots, and probably he also realized that organizing a proper genocide throughout the entire kingdom would take some time anyways. So he needed time to talk the king into going along with his plan, get word out to all the provinces, and make sure people in the various provinces had time to organize their own mass murder parties. But we see, even in all of this, as ugly and distasteful as this is, we see God's work here again. God's arranging events to give Esther and Mordecai the time they need to make sure his people can be saved. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. Something that's going to happen a year from now. So there's time to come up with a way of stopping it. Haman, though, but he's got this plan, and he's got a date picked out. So then he goes to see the king. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There's a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So Haman's pride, his insecurity, his lack of conscience, and his anti-Semitism all lead him down a very dark path to the point where he's eager to commit genocide. Haman's one of the most purely evil men in the Bible, and that's a book that's not lacking at all in purely evil men. He's a prime example of the type of person we can all become if we separate ourselves from God's instruction on the difference between right and wrong. As rotten as he is, there's dark paths we're all capable of going down. And that's a reminder. We need to know what God says is right and wrong to make sure we don't go down a dark path. 5 centuries later, Paul could have been describing Haman personally when he wrote in Romans, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts was darkened." So to get the king to go along with his plan, Haman is mixing half-truths in with his claims that the Jews are a threat to the kingdom. That part's an outright lie. They are a people who are dispersed amongst the empire, and they did have their own laws, but these laws did not prevent them from being good citizens to the Persian Empire, and there was no reason to think otherwise. There was no reason at that time, or at all, at any time, to think of the Jewish people as being a threat to the Persian Empire. But Haman stresses that the Jews are different. He lies outright about them being disobedient to the king's laws, and he caps off the argument with is essentially a bribe of 10,000 talents, which translates into some millions of dollars nowadays. King Xerxes seems to have been easily influenced by his advisors. It's just like if you had his ear, you could just say anything and he'd say, yeah, sure, whatever. It was advice from his court that convinced him to put King Vashti aside and later to search his kingdom for a new queen. It seems he had little or no discernment in this area. If he liked you, even if you didn't deserve it, if you earned his trust, whether you deserved that trust or not, he'd pretty much do whatever you'd say. So he immediately accepts what Haman was saying about the Jews without argument and immediately agrees to the genocide. He gives Haman his signet ring. This gives Haman full authority to do whatever he liked. And he tells Haman the bribe isn't necessary. He just turns down all that. I'll do what you want. Xerxes was a weak-willed idiot. And he had no moral compass of his own. He blindly accepted that all the Jews were plotting against him, and he agrees without argument that to have them all killed. He had no idea at this moment that his new beautiful trophy wife was herself Jewish. So Haman's got to get on with his plan. He is a despicable human being, but he was apparently a good bureaucrat. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews, young, old, women, and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province. It was made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. So word is sent all over the vast Persian Empire to attack the Jews on a specific day. And to make sure people go through with it, it gives everybody permission to plunder their goods. So it's just, why do we want to kill these people? We get to keep all their stuff. Okay, we'll do it. So it was an order so bizarre and so bloodthirsty that it baffled the local population of Susa, where the palace was. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So even the sophisticated capital of the empire was shocked by this. Probably other minority groups were wondering if they might be next on the king's new hit list. A theologian named Irving Jensen wrote, not only the Jews, but non-Jews reacted to this outrageous example of violent despotism. Sometimes the masses are wrong, but not always. Here we have a situation where the king and his high minister were an erring minority with extensive authority. But all people, nations and individuals alike, must reckon with the highest authority, God. The king's decree was issued and posted, but the King of Kings would have the last word. But anyway, whatever the reaction of the population around them, Haman and Xerxes were indifferent to all that. Their word was law, and they were concerned about what others might think. When the king sat down to drink, he thought he had done well, but he did not really understand what he had done. Haman also sat down to drink and thought he had done well, and he knew exactly what he intended to do. So God then sets up the next domino in the chain. Mordecai and Esther step up to the plate. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. So Mordecai was not just lamenting the fact of the decree to destroy the Jews, but also because he knew that the royal decree could not be revoked, even by the king. And that's important to keep in mind. The king was pretty much all-powerful. The one thing he couldn't do was revoke one of his own decrees. Remember the story of Daniel in the lion's den, which also took place within the Persian Empire a few generations before this. The king at that time was Darius the Great, Xerxes' grandfather, and he issued a decree that was then used to get Daniel sentenced to death. Despite being the king, whose word was law in most cases, Darius didn't have the power to revoke his own decrees. Remember, even after he regretted, he recognized what the bad guys had done, and he didn't want Daniel killed. There was nothing he could do about it, because he can't revoke his own decrees. And he couldn't save Daniel from being thrown into the lions. It took God's intervention to save Daniel's life. So that means that Xerxes, even if he changed his mind, could not revoke the decree. In a year's time, the Jewish people would be attacked and wiped out. It would again take God's intervention to save his people. And that intervention was coming, this time through the actions of people that God had placed in exactly the right place to act at exactly the right time. So Mordecai hears that, Esther hears that Mordecai is in mourning. But she herself, she's relatively isolated in the palace, and she's not necessarily privy to news of the outside world. And she has no idea why he's in mourning. So first, she tries to send him clothes so they can change out of the sackcloth, but he refuses. Now remember that Esther couldn't go see Mordecai himself. She couldn't go outside the palace. So all communication she had with him was through her immediate servants, who would take messages back and forth. So the conversation they're having now is like the 5th century BC version of texting. Mm-hmm. They're never personally seeing each other. Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what troubled Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go to the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So Esther must have been bowled over when she read this. Her people were to be destroyed, including the man who had raised her as his own daughter. Mordecai is urging her to go to the king and plead for mercy. It's likely that Mordecai realized that when looked at from a purely human point of view, this probably wouldn't do any good. Even if the king wanted to help, remember that his original decree could not be revoked. So Mordecai likely had no idea that it was God's plan to raise him into a position where he could issue a counter decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves. But we'll see in a few verses that Mordecai does trust God to save his people. So perhaps he was seeing God's hands in the events already. At any rate, he's using the opportunity God has presented him by making Esther queen. How likely it was to work, only God would know. Mordecai wasn't worried about that. He was simply trusting in God, and he was moving forward along the path that God had laid out for him, even though he didn't know where that path was going. It's not wrong for us to make long-term plans. In fact, we should. But when we trust in God and go where he wants us to go, he doesn't always tell us what's going to happen next. But we need to take that step anyway and trust him. There's no way Mordecai knew what was going to happen next. There's absolutely no way that would have even been a vague idea. It's all too weird when it happened. But he saw, well, here's something I can do. God's given me this opportunity. Doesn't seem like it can work, but it's there, and I'm just going to go with it and trust in God. Esther, though, reminds her adopted father just how much danger she would be facing. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of his royal provinces know that any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends his golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So for Esther to go to the king without being invited was literally to put her life in danger. From another commentary, Persian monarchs, like those in most ancient nations, were protected against unwanted visitors. Esther reminded Mordecai that she could not simply enter the king's inner chambers unannounced, or she might be put to death. The king had the power to execute anyone who disturbed him without an appointment. For the king to extend his golden scepter was to someone showed he approved of the visit, and that person was welcome and not in danger of death. Since Esther had not been summoned by him for a month, she did not know whether his attitude towards him would be favorable. It had been a while since he'd even thought twice about her, so Maybe maybe he was just done with her and would be annoyed by her and just say, "Oop, take her out and hang her." And that was entirely possible that that could happen. So Mordecai was asking Esther to put her life at risk. And this could not have been an easy thing for him to do. Once again, it's clear from the book, from the text, that he loved her like a daughter. But God sometimes asks us to do hard things. Accepting that a loved one might be called on to do something dangerous, to go into the mission field or a country that endures persecution, for instance, can be hard. Trust in God is a requirement, whether we're asked to risk our own lives or to allow those we love to take on risks. I have no doubt that Mordecai would have gladly placed himself at risk if he could have spared Esther. But that's not what God was asking him to do. God was asking him to tell his daughter to do something that could get her killed. But 2 Timothy 1 says, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." So Mordecai calls on his adoptive daughter to be courageous and take risks. So when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" So Mordecai is convinced that God has not forgotten his people. Relief and deliverance for the Jews will arrive, he says. One commentator says that despite his emotional turmoil, deep down, Mordecai is sure that the Jews will survive. This reflects his faith that God will protect his people, though the text does not make this explicit. But the coolest part of these verses is Mordecai's statement that perhaps Esther has come to a royal position for such a time as this. Perhaps God knew what he was doing. Perhaps everything that's happened, from Vashti's removal to queen to Esther being chosen among the hundreds of candidates, is a part of God's plan. Remember that Mordecai could not possibly have predicted how all this would turn out, but he's trusting in God, and he's following the path that God has laid out for him one step at a time. In Proverbs chapter 3, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." He also reminds Esther that if the decree is carried out, Esther is likely to die as well. Haman's power is sufficient to reach into the palace. So she might as well take action. She really has nothing to lose. Now, I think that Esther is truly terrified at this point. Anybody would be. But she doesn't let her fear lead her. This is where we find out that Esther is just awesome. I know she was trusting in God and getting her courage from God, and we give all glory to God, but it's impossible not to admire her personally. She takes what Mordecai tells her to heart, and she does indeed step forward in faith and in courage. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So first, she calls on the people to fast and implicitly to pray for her. This is not a spontaneous outpouring of grief, as it was in verse 3 when Mordecai did the ashes and sackcloth thing, but an organized activity aimed at increasing Esther's chance of success through earnest prayer, the strongest indication yet of Esther's and Mordecai's faith in God. Second, she says, "If I perish, I perish." Esther's not being fatalistic or suicidal. Instead, she realizes that God is asking her to risk her life. And there's no guarantee that she will survive. God may be asking her to give her life. Esther realizes that God cannot be manipulated, even by fasting and by prayer. Whatever happens will happen according to God's plan. But she is asking for prayer to give her the courage to go forward, and if it's within God's plan, to spare her life. All of this is appropriate. David Guzik again points out that Jesus exhorted us to have the same attitude. "Do not fear those who will kill the body, but cannot kill the soul," from Matthew 10. Paul is also an example of this attitude from Philippians: to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So then the next domino gets set up, Esther's bold request. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So after 3 days of fasting and prayer, Esther takes her life in her hands and approaches the king. Remember again that she was literally risking her life. Xerxes was a huge jerk in a lot of ways. And he was someone who would have been quite capable of ordering Esther's execution if she displeased him. But we see God's hand is still active in these events. How much Xerxes might have cared for Esther and how much he just thought she was really gorgeous is something we don't know. But in either case, he welcomes her into his presence. And then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." And now, clearly, that's not a literal offer. Xerxes isn't going to give half his kingdom to anyone. But he wants to please Esther, and he's using this phrase as an idiom to let her know he'll do anything he can for her. And Esther replies, "If it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I've prepared for him." So God is at work here in either one of two ways. It's most likely that Esther had carefully planned her next step. And she's working to win the king's confidence and set Haman up for a colossal fall. So she's deliberately putting on kind of a Mission Impossible type plan into effect here. Now, it's also possible that she was very frightened and she hadn't thought through what to do next if the king had welcomed her. And relieved that she wouldn't be killed and uncertain of what to do next, she just basically blurts out, "You want to come to my party?" It's the first thing she thinks of. So God's either using her intellect or he's using her fear and shyness. But in either case, God is using Esther to save his people. Now, Romans 8:28, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. So all the stuff that's happening, even the sinful stuff, God is using to set up Esther to save her people. So God really does turn all things to good. Mordecai urged Esther to see the king, stepping forward in faith even if he didn't know what would come next. Esther does the same thing. Whatever her mindset at the moment, whether she was doing a pre-prepared plan or whether she was just blurting out the first thing she could think of, she takes the next step God placed in front of her, trusting in him to know what the ultimate plan was. The next chapter, I left out a quotation mark. I noticed stuff like that, I'm sorry. "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so we may do as Esther asked." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." I always kind of wish here that Esther had literally asked for half the kingdom just to see what the reaction would be. But Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them, and then I will answer the king's question." So Esther throws the party for the king and Haman, which apparently goes well. See, she's indeed gaining the king's confidence, but she delays bringing her real purpose for another day. And once again, there's several possible reasons for this. It could be that she wanted to ingratiate herself with the king. Keep in mind that she hadn't seen him for at least a month before this. It's also possible that once again, her courage failed both times. She was still working up the courage she needed to do what she had to do. Or she wanted to, if she was being more deliberate in this, the Mission Impossible plan, she wanted to build up an element of suspense and impress on the king that her business was vital and not a mere whim. It's also possible, depending on how much she was pre-planning all this, that she wanted to inflate Haman's pride and take him off guard before she exposed him as a vicious murderer. Perhaps all elements of all these ideas entered into her strategy. But once again, whether she's able to think this out or whether she's improvising as she goes along, she is trusting in God, and God is arranging events so that the Jewish people will be saved. But the next domino is Haman's rage against Mordecai. So Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. So remember that Haman's personality can be accurately described as a combination of monumental ego and sociopathic hatred. So he thinks he's in good with the queen now, as well as the king. The queen might be gaining influence over the king, but Haman isn't worried about that as long as he's being invited to the parties as well. From his point of view, he would be thinking that the queen getting influence at court is a good thing as long as he can manipulate her as well as the king. You know, he has no idea that Esther is essentially running a con game on him and setting him up for a rather abrupt fall from grace. So he's walking on air. He's feeling like the most important person on the planet, and he's probably feeling like he deserves to be the most important person on the planet. And when he sees Mordecai, and the Jew again refuses to honor him, so that just like spoils everything. It's just interfering with his perfect world. So he storms home, and calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he'd been elevated above all the other noble officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And he has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. So Haman actually manages a pretty impressive accomplishment here. He manages both to brag unashamedly about himself while at the same time throwing a temper tantrum. So his wife Zeresh and all his friends came to him and said, well, have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits. And when the king in the morning and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go to the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So generally, it's nice to see a wife fully supporting her husband, but here we simply find out that Zeresh is just as casual about killing people as Haman is. So I guess they made a good couple. So she fully accepts that his influence with the king is great, and she assumes that he can simply ask the king to have somebody killed, and it will happen. You know, Haman is pleased at the thought as well, and that perks his spirits up. Hey, I can have him killed in the morning. And then he immediately has the pole set up. Now, by the way, depending on what translation you're using, that verse in your Bible might say a gallows to hang him rather than a pole to impale him on. The original Hebrew word is translated as tree, so the way it's used here could be either mean a gallows or an impaling pole. In either case, Haman is planning on executing Mordecai in a very brutal and very public manner. You know, David Guzik again, we should never underestimate the destructive and distorting power of hatred. The same irrational, violent hatred that made Haman want to see Mordecai hanged to his death is the same irrational, violent hatred that made man want to hang Jesus on a cross. But things are going to go wrong for Mordecai the next morning. Mordecai is honored by the king. We again see God's hands in these events, moving things along in a manner that God has prescribed. Because that night, sleep escaped the king. So he ordered a book recording daily events to be brought and read to the king. They found the written report of how Mordecai had informed on Bigthana and Teresh, two eunuchs who guarded the king's entrance, when they planned to assassinate King Xerxes. The king inquired, what honor and special recognition has been given to Mordecai for this act? The king's personal attendants replied, well, nothing's been done for him. So Haman is planning on seeing the king in the morning and asking Mordecai to be killed. But it just happens that the king is having trouble getting to sleep that night. And so he has somebody read to him. And the chosen reading material, it turns out, just happens to include an account of how Mordecai once saved the king by revealing an assassination plot. So God's watching out for us, even if we're not aware of the dangers around us. So the king asked, well, who's in court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to ask the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared for him. The king's attendants answered him, Haman's out there standing in the court. Well, have him enter, the king ordered. This situation that happens now is worthy of a screwball comedy. Right. Really. Haman is coming to see the king, full of hatred for Mordecai and arrogantly confident that the king is in his pocket and will readily agree to having Mordecai killed. But the king, with no idea of what Haman is there for, decides that Haman is exactly the right person to decide how to honor Mordecai for saving the king's life. So it gets worse for Haman. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for a man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, well, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have him bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king had ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what the man has done for the king delights to honor. So from Haman's point of view, everything's always about him. So the king wants to honor somebody. Well, it must be him. It obviously doesn't occur to him that the king's referring to anybody but him. I want to honor the coolest guy in the kingdom. Oh, that's got to be me. So he thought of himself as like the Fonzie of the Persian Empire, right? So, who else is that awesome? Who else does the king like that much? It can't possibly be anyone else. So he suggests the most public way to honor someone, making sure that the population of Susa would be reminded of just how awesome he is and will honor him in the way that he obviously deserves. He even puts off asking for Mordecai to be killed for the moment. He can get back to that after he's arranged his own parade. This is all awesome. Nothing's ever been better for Haman at this moment. What happens next would have been utterly humiliating to him. Though he wouldn't have been able to even hint at the king that he objected to it in any way. So go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. So Haman is forced to lead his worst enemy around on horseback, proclaiming that all must honor him. And Mordecai is being honored in the highest possible way. To be given a royal robe previously worn by the king was a sign of great honor in the king's favor. Herodotus, the 5th century BC Greek historian, who is known as the father of history and who wrote chiefly about the Persian Wars, stated that the kings of Persia had horses of remarkable beauty and of a particular breed that were brought from Armenia. To ride a horse that the king had ridden was almost as great an honor as to sit on his throne. Almost, but not quite. So for a man consumed with vanity and arrogance like Haman, all of this must have been the worst moment of his life up to that moment. Things are actually going to get worse for him at that moment. But he would have felt utterly degraded. But there is worse even to come. Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home, his head covered in grief, and told Zeresh and his wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. So he goes home to throw another temper tantrum and whine to his wife and friends. His advisor and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall was started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. When they were all talking with him, the king's eunuch arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So true to form, he runs home to throw another tantrum in front of his family. But this time, his wife and friends don't have a convenient murder they can urge him to commit to cheer him up. Instead, they begin to realize that maybe he's bitten off more than he can chew. Even Haman's wife and advisors sense that an irresistible power or person protects the Jewish people. So the next domino is Haman's end. So the king and Haman came to the feast with Esther the queen. Once again, on the second day, while drinking wine, the king asked Esther, Queen Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you. Whatever you seek, even to half the kingdom, will be done. So Esther's second banquet begins. Again, the king is obviously pleased with her. And again, he offers to grant whatever wish she might have. If all of this was pre-planned by Esther, then she chose this moment as the moment of truth. If she'd been hemming and hawing with fear, then this was the moment when she looked to God for courage to do what she needed to do. In either case, we see God's perfect timing at work. It was just the right moment for what comes next. Queen Esther answered, if I have obtained your approval, my king, and if the king is pleased to spare my life, This is my request, and spare my people. This is my desire. For my people and I have been sold out to destruction, death, and extermination. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept silent. Indeed, the trouble wouldn't be worth burdening the king. Xerxes spoke up and asked Esther, who is it? And where is the one who would devise such a scheme? And Esther answered, the adversary and enemy is the evil Haman. So it's interesting to see that Esther actually acts with wisdom here, which is why I think all of this was pre-planned. Because she plays on Xerxes' self-interest rather than appealing to his sense of right and wrong. Xerxes, after all, had casually signed an issue to commit genocide on Haman's say-so, so he doesn't have a very well-developed sense of right and wrong. So Esther points out that the Jews would be worth more alive than dead. Haman, in the meantime, sees his entire world crashing down around him with that one last sentence. Up until this point, he knew that he was the most important person in the world. He knew he had the king of Persia in his back pocket, and he was completely confident that he'd soon be tucking the queen into that pocket as well, solidifying his already unbreakable power base. Despite the painfully embarrassing setback that had happened that morning regarding Mordecai, I don't think his ego would have allowed him to seriously consider anything drastic going wrong. Even when his wife and advisors warned him that he might not win, I think his ego and his inflated sense of self-worth would have meant he himself could not fully accept this. He would have gone to that party thinking, I can salvage all this, I can still get Mordecai killed, everything's going to work out because I'm cool, I'm awesome, it can't happen any other way. But now he can't ignore what's happened. His head is literally on the chopping block, and it doesn't seem like there's anything he can do to change this. Now, it might be a little mean-spirited, but I have to admit that I really enjoy the next part. Haman stood terrified before the king and queen. Angered by this, the king arose from where they were drinking wine and went to the palace garden. Haman remained to beg Queen Esther for his life because he realized the king was planning something terrible for him. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the house of wine drinking, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, would he actually violate the queen while I'm at the palace? As soon as this statement left the king's mouth, Haman's face was covered. So the king tromps off to the garden to consider what to do next. Normally he'd ask his advisor, but it's his main advisor he's mad at it, so he has to make up his own mind for once. And Haman falls down before Esther, literally begging for his life. So when the king comes back, he sees Haman lying next to Esther on the couch, and to him, it looks like Esther's either attacking the queen or even trying to put moves on her. So it would have been hard to think of any way the situation could have gotten worse for Haman, but it just did. So Haman's face, it's screwball comedy stuff. It really is. Haman's face is covered, which was a common practice in many countries at a time when a man is condemned to death. It probably meant to signify that the condemned man was no longer worthy to look at the king, but in practical terms, it meant that Haman at this moment was a dead man walking. He was going to be immediately executed. So Harbona, one of the royal eunuchs, said, well, there's a gallows 70 feet high just at Haman's house that he made for Mordecai, who gave the report to save the king. So I just would have loved to see Xerxes' reaction at this point. Okay, he was going to have the guy who saved me killed above everything else. Everything that happens just makes it worse for Haman. And the king commanded, hang him on it. And they hanged Haman from the gallows he prepared for Mordecai, and then the king's anger subsided. And once again, remember, it can be translated either hanged or impaled. In either case, he died publicly and unpleasantly. So in a final act of poetic justice, Haman's killed on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. From Psalm 7, it says, behold, the wicked bring forth iniquity. Yes, he conceives trouble and brings forth falsehood. He made a pit and dug it out, and has fallen into the ditch which he made. His troubles shall return on his head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown. Nobody gets away from anything. Their punishment may come in the afterlife if they don't repent, but nobody ever gets away with anything. Their evil always comes back to them. All right, the last thing that has to happen, the last domino that has to fall is saving the Jews. Things are moving by now quickly along the path that God had been laying out all the time. A chain of dominoes that were being toppled at exactly the right time to bring all this about. But at this moment, the king's original decree giving people permission to attack the Jews and loot them was still in effect. And remember that not even the king had the power to reverse his own decrees. So there's a couple of more dominoes that need to fall to save God's people. On that same day, whoop, did I skip one?
Yeah.
I did. On that same day, Xerxes awarded Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Mordecai entered the king's presence because Esther had revealed her relationship to Mordecai. The king removed his signet ring he had recovered from Haman and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther put him in charge of Haman's estate. So first the king gives Esther Haman's estate, and then he finds out the guy who saved him from the assassins is related to his queen. So Mordecai is brought before the king. He's given the king's signet ring, the ring Haman had been wearing. So Mordecai is now invested with royal authority, just as Haman had been. Then Esther addressed the king again. She fell at his feet, wept, and begged him to revoke the evil of Haman the Agagite and his plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the gold scepter towards Esther, so she got up and stood before the king. So Esther, by this time, is probably pretty sure she can go to the king at any time and be welcome, at least for the time being. She makes one last appeal to revoke the decree, but that's the one thing the king can't do. So an alternate plan is needed. She said, "If it pleases the king, and I have found approval before him, if the matter seems right to the king and I am pleasing in his sight, let a royal edict be written. Let it revoke the documents the scheming Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, who wrote to destroy the Jews who were in all the king's provinces. For how could I bear to see the disaster that would come upon his people? How could I bear to see the destruction of my relatives?" King Xerxes said to Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, "Look, I have given Haman's estate to Esther, and he was hanged on the gallows because he attacked the Jews. You may write in the king's name whatever pleases you concerning the Jews and seal it with the royal signet ring. A document written in the king's name and sealed with the royal signet cannot be revoked." So either Mordecai or Esther has an idea. If the original decree can't be revoked, how about another decree to supersede it? It all sounds very bureaucratical, but it's the way things worked. Xerxes gives the go-ahead for this plan and even reminds Mordecai that he now has the signet ring. He can write anything he wants, and he can stamp it with the ring, giving it the king's authority. So Mordecai gets to work. There's about 9 months left before the day when the Jews would be destroyed. He gets another edict written up and has it sent by messengers to all 127 provinces within the Persian Empire. The king's edict gave the Jews in each and every city the right to assemble and defend themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate every ethnic and provincial army hostile to them, including women and children, and to take their possessions as spoils of war. This would take place on a single day throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. So on the day the Jews could be attacked, the Jews were given permission to preemptively strike back. They could, in fact, wipe out and loot anyone who was planning on wiping out and looting them. Suddenly, they were no longer an easy target and an easy source of wealth. Instead, they were armed and dangerous foes if you went up against them. And this worked perfectly. The Jewish people knew they were now safe. Not only could they defend themselves, but it was now clear that the Jews were now being viewed favorably by the king. It's entirely possible that Xerxes was doing this because he was enamored of Esther, and not because it was simply the right thing to do. Whatever his feelings were, it meant that the Jews were now safe.
It's like the Cold War.
Basically, yes. Mordecai went from the king's presence clothed in royal purple and white, with a great gold crown and a purple robe of fine linen. The city of Susa shouted and rejoiced, and the Jews celebrated with gladness, joy, and honor. In every province and every city, wherever the king's command and his law reached, joy and rejoicing took place among the Jews. There was a celebration and a holiday, and many of the ethnic groups of the land professed themselves to be Jews because of fear of the Jews had overcome them. So the celebration in Susa shows that though anti-Semitism was and is a very real thing, it was not universal. Many people, in fact, turned to Judaism, often out of fear rather than true conversion. But it meant that many of them would have been learning about the one true God, and it's reasonable to hope that many of them would have eventually sincerely turned their hearts to God. Next, we have the Jews destroy their enemies. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanding the king was carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in the cities of all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread through the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased with those who hated them. Now, it's important to note that the Jews were not just randomly slaughtering people. They attacked only those they knew were preparing to slaughter them. They acted in self-defense. And later on, we are told that the Jews did not lay their hands on plunder. So they were acting in total self-defense. They weren't doing this to loot and get rich, which would have been the motivation for people planning to attack them in many cases. They were simply acting in self-defense. Chapter 9 does go on to give us some numbers. 500 people and Haman's 10 sons were killed in the city of Susa. So the situation's been completely reversed. As the book opened, Haman was being honored by the king while plotting to kill the Jews, and especially his archenemy Mordecai. By the end of the book, Haman's dead, Mordecai is being honored, Haman's family's dead also, and the enemies of the Jews are destroyed. Now, the next day, Esther goes to the king and asks permission to extend the edict to continue attacking, to allow the Jews to continue to attack their enemies. And 300 more men are killed in Susa, and Haman's sons, who had been killed the day before, were taken and impaled on poles. Some people have accused Esther of vindictiveness because of this, of going on with the extra day. But I don't think that charge holds up. To quote one commentator, her conduct in making this request to continue the permission to attack their enemies another day is, that the argument against it being vindictive are that Haman's sons had taken a prominent part in avenging their father's fall and had been previously slain in the melee. The order for the exposure of their dead bodies on the gallows was only intended to brand them with public infamy for their malice and hatred to the Jews. So taking their bodies and impaling them on the poles wasn't vindictiveness, but it was a part of what would have been seen as justice in that culture. It's something we can disagree with in our day and age, but Esther would have been asking for what that culture would have considered justice. And then for them to continue and attack and kill people, it's because the anti-Jewish party, having in all probability been instigated through the arts and influence of Haman to act of spiteful and wanton oppression, the existing state of feeling among the natives requires some vigorous and decisive measure to prevent the outbreak of full aggressions. That's the most complicated sentence I have in here. But it basically means that there were still people out there willing to attack the Jews if they could get away with it. So the Jews were again acting in preemptive self-defense on that second day as well. So the additional deaths were probably because there were still armed men in Susa who were attempting to carry out the first edict about killing the Jews. I do not think that you can accuse Esther of vindictiveness in asking that the Jews being able to defend themselves another day was it was just a proper thing to do. It was still self-defense. Now, elsewhere in the Persian Empire, a total of 75,000 people were killed. The population of the Persian Empire at that time is estimated to be about 49 million people, which is about 44% of the estimated population of the world at that time. Mm-hmm. Those are all estimates, obviously. You have to take archaeology and make some guesses, but they're reasonable estimates. So it's about 0.0015% of the population died. And I'm not minimizing that a lot of people died, but the small percentage of the total population does support the idea that the Jews were only attacking those who were going to attack them. It was a preemptive self-defense. And they weren't randomly slaughtering people, or the death toll would have been a lot higher. So throughout Jewish history, there's been a pattern to establishing their various holidays and celebration through the years. It always starts out with someone's trying to kill or enslave us, then it's followed by, yay, we're still alive, and then it's followed by, let's eat. So yeah, pretty much. So that's what happens here. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, at the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned to joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So actually the various Jewish celebrations, including this one, and those detailed in the book of Moses, are examples of God's wisdom at work. They help the Jews remember that God had saved and protected them again and again. And it does this through a time of joyful fellowship with each other. It brings them together as a community while worshiping and honoring God. And it's not a bad system at all. It's a minor but important lesson we take from Esther. A Christian, as Christians, we're part of the same family of believers, and we should be meeting in joyful celebration on a regular basis. Now, the festival is called Purim. Am I saying it right? Purim? Purim? In the Persian language, Pur means lot, referring to Haman having chosen the date to destroy the Jews by throwing lots, only to have that chosen day turn out to be one of victory and deliverance for the Jews. And so Esther ends with a very short chapter 10. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king has promoted, are they not written in the annuals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. So God had placed Mordecai in a position not just to save his people from immediate danger, but to look after their welfare on a regular basis. Charles Spurgeon wrote, Mordecai was a true patriot, and therefore, being exalted in the highest position under Xerxes, he used his eminence to promote the prosperity of Israel. In this, he was a type of Jesus, who on his throne of glory seeks not his own, but spends his power for his people. It were well if every Christian would be a Mordecai to the church, striving according to his ability for its prosperity. Some are placed in stations of affluence and influence. Let them honor their Lord in the high places of the earth and testify for Jesus before great men. Others have what is far better, namely close fellowship with the King of Kings. Let them be sure to plead daily for the weak of the Lord's people, the doubting, the tempted, and the comfortless. So Mordecai sets an example for us. He's in a position where he can regularly honor God by looking after his people, and he does so. Whatever God position puts us in to look out for the church, not the building, but the church, the people, then that's an honor that we should accept fully. So remember that though God is not directly referred to anywhere in the book of Esther, we can clearly see his hand at work throughout the book. Every domino that falls leads directly to the next one, letting events unfold in exactly the right way to save the Jews from a genocidal madman. Here's a list. I've stolen one last thing from David Guzik's commentary, and I should have divided this between two slides. That's kind of small, sorry about that. But God arranged for noble Vashti to lose her place. God arranged for a competition to replace Queen Vashti. God arranged for Esther to enter the competition. God arranged special favor for Esther among the other women. God arranged for Mordecai to have access to both Esther and the affairs of the kingdom. God arranged the lot to be cast to give 11 months warning before the evil event. God arranged that the decree commanding the Jews to be killed by private hands instead of the army of Persia, which would have been much more difficult to stop. God arranged that Haman restrain his anger and not kill Mordecai immediately. God arranged for Esther to delay her request, first by asking for a banquet with the king and then another banquet. God arranged for Haman's anger to come to a peak on one particular day. God arranged for Xerxes to have a sleepless night. God arranged for Xerxes to pick a certain book in his sleepless night. And God arranged for Xerxes to read the passage about Mordecai in that particular book. God is setting up things exactly. So God had a plan. God always has a plan. He had a plan for the nation of Israel. He had a plan for Mordecai and Esther. So he has a plan for you and me. God always has a plan, and he's always arranging things, whether they seem good or bad from our perspective, to give you an opportunity to serve him. You know, God created each and every one of us. From Psalm 139, for you created my innermost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. And he created you for a purpose. He has a plan for you. He has stuff for you to do. Most of us won't be tasked with preventing genocide, but he still has something challenging and satisfying and useful for us to do. He has something planned for you before he made you, before he made the world. He knew you'd be here. He knew the gifts he had given you, and he has plans for you. You know, Psalm 33, but the plans of the Lord stay firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. And from Isaiah 25, Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you and praise your name. For in perfect faithfulness you have done wonderful things, things planned long ago. So God always has a plan for each and every one of us. The events of your life, whether good or bad, are unfolding in a way that will open up opportunities for you to serve God. You know, difficult times and personal tragedies are legitimately painful things, and I'm not minimizing that at all. But whatever happens in your life, God will give you a chance to use it to do his work. God chooses to work through us, and he chooses, just as he chose to work through Mordecai and Esther. You know, God's purpose would have been accomplished no matter what, but everyone involved had free will, and Mordecai and Esther freely chose to follow God, just as Haman chose to follow his sinful nature. You know, God's will is accomplished, yet men are perfectly free agents. Haman did what he pleased, Xerxes did what he wanted, so did Mordecai and Esther. We say no interference, no coercion. They all do their will and bear full responsibility, yet God works out his eternal plan for the ages through it all. So once again, remember, God has a plan for you. That's the big takeaway from Esther, at least the one I want to stress tonight. But it's your choice whether or not to follow him. And choosing to follow him is always the better choice. God's plans are going to be accomplished no matter what, so you might as well be a part of those plans. So just remember that God always has a plan for you. And you don't have to depend on your own strength or your own wisdom to be a part of God's plans. You know, he'll be with you every step of the way. He'll take you out of your comfort box, and he'll probably give you more than you can handle. You know, if you ever hear somebody say God won't give you more than you can handle, they're wrong. He will give you more than you can handle. But then he'll be with you there to help you handle it. So God knows, so know that God is with you, walk where he points you to walk, and trust in him to see you through. That's what Esther did when she walked into the throne room that day. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she took the next step, the step that God told her to. And all of us can do the same thing. You know, from Psalm 37, a man's steps are established by the Lord, and he takes pleasure in his way. Though he falls, he will not be overwhelmed because the Lord holds his hand. So that is the book of Esther. Any comments or questions? Thank you. Thank you. Any questions from anybody or comments?
Just quickly, drunkenness is prevalent throughout Esther.
It is.
In a big way. What do you make of that?
Well, that's once again God's using the sinful behavior of sinful men to do his will, which he does throughout the Bible. So Xerxes makes a drunken decision about Vashti, but that's part of God's plan. And it doesn't mean, anytime God does that, it never means that the people aren't responsible for their sins. They have chosen of their own free will to commit those sins, and they are morally responsible to God for it, in need of forgiveness and the need to act repentance. That's always true. But God will use those actions to further his plans anyway. You know, the ultimate example is Judas, who freely chose to betray Jesus and was responsible for that sin. And if he had handled his guilt in a healthy way by repenting rather than hanging himself, we'd probably be reading about him in Acts as one of the heroes of the church.
And people might name their kids Judas.
Yes, yeah. But he was responsible for that, for his sin, responsible to God for it, but God still used that to carry out his plan. Same with Xerxes and his drunkenness and Haman's genocidal mania and all that. So,
You know, I just sort of was thinking about Hitler during all of this.
Yeah.
You know, how this thing sort of drifted, and then also the people who really realized what was happening were devastated. And
Yeah.
that's why so many Jews were actually saved. Because people who could see what was happening, kind of like with the Jews in Mordecai, they couldn't believe.
yeah.
Because it sort of crept in real slow. And then all of a sudden, there they are.
There they are, yeah.
I mean, it's not exactly, but I had that
It's difficult not to make that
Overlay,
that analogy, because
about
it's
the
two
Jews.
it's two different attempts in history for genocide of all the Jews.
to be an
Yeah.
And the Lord
But
preserved
yeah, But I wanted to add, the book of Habakkuk is exactly about that, about God using sinful people. Habakkuk was complaining to God about that. How can you do this? They're worse than we are. How can you use them? And God just said, well, because I can. And I will turn all things to good, and my purposes will be fulfilled. So, yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
This is a major holiday for Jewish people.
Okay. So, well, you get cookies.
But why did Haman
Major holiday.
I like rubella.
Oh, I like rubella. But why would the cookies be in the shape of Haman's hat?
Because they devour them.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So,
I get that.
and by our calendar, what time of year is Purim? I don't even know. Or is it different every
I'm
year?
trying to think, because the months as stated in the Bible are all Babylonian names.
Oh, okay.
So the Jews never had names. God only gave the months, the name of the first month, second month, third
Mhm.
month. But they came up with, Elul and Nisan and
Okay.
all this out of Babylon.
Yeah. Well, something has to go on the
Well, we
calendars.
can look it up.
Okay.
I know it was the 12th month,
Okay.
so that's the very last month.
Okay. So,
According to Google, it's March.
March? Okay. So it's close to Passover. So,
Google knows everything.
okay.
It must be right if it's on the internet.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions or comments before I pray? And yes.
When Mordecai told Esther that she wouldn't be spared, that she would perish,
Mm-hmm.
why would she have perished if nobody knew that she was Jewish?
He's probably, actually, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm going to have to see if anybody commented on that in commentaries.
Because she never revealed it.
Yeah. Well, actually, Mordecai had been outed as a Jew by that point, and a little bit of questioning in his neighborhood.
Didn't she say my people?
Yeah. the
Yeah.
reaction would-
Yeah, but even if she kept her, you just could have asked at Mordecai's home about his family, and you could have found out Esther was Jewish. A little investigation would have brought it out. But why Mordecai thought it was for sure is actually a good question. I hadn't thought about that, and it's an excellent question. I do know.
The messages back and forth.
So yeah, the servants would have known. So you would have just needed one servant who would have been rotten to rat her out. So it wasn't. I mean, if anybody asked, it would have been easy to find out because Mordecai was hanging out there every day, trading messages with her. So I presume that Mordecai just knew it was a secret only as long as the king didn't bother asking.
And
So,
it was only a
but-
secret in the palace.
Yeah, that's true.
So if
Everybody
all
else.
the neighbors knew.
Yeah,
so-
yeah. So I'm going to assume because it was a secret that could have easily been found out. It's a great question though, and I don't know the answer for sure. But I don't think it would have been difficult to discover. Haman would have killed Mordecai, and he would have thought, I want to make sure I get his family. Let's ask around. And he would have been confident that he could have gotten rid of the queen too. So anything else? Okay, well, let's pray. Okay, well, Lord, thank you again for tonight, and just let us all be confident that you have a plan for us. And when you ask us to step forward in courage, that we look to you for that courage to do so, that we know you can give us more than we can handle because you'll be there to help us handle it. And just be with us in all things. In Jesus' name, amen.